What's up guys, hope you're having a good day. In this video we're going to be taking a deep dive into 3 of the main card fights taking place this weekend at UFC Fight Night, Moreno versus Albazi. We've already broken down the rest of the main card. I'll leave a link for that video in the description below. And I hope you find these breakdowns useful. I hope they help you make better betting decisions this weekend, maybe even earn some extra cash. As ever, all of these breakdowns are backed up by many hours of research and 15 years of experience. Made a profit every single year over the last 15 years betting on the UFC, and this year will be no different. And so the information I'm going to be sharing with you in these breakdowns is coming from a real good place, so I hope you're going to appreciate it, find it useful. If you do, please hit the like button below, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'd also like to apologize for how late this video is being uploaded. So now we will get into the first breakdown, which is going to be Malott versus Giles. And again, I'd just like to apologize for how late this video is going out. When you have these cards with 14 fights on them, it's a lot of fights. Generally, they're time consuming to research anyway, so if ever you see a UFC fight card with 14 fights, usually it's going to take me a long time to research a card this big, get out breakdown videos for all the fights. But what's cool about this card is that there's a lot of amazing fights on this card, a lot of really good, competitive, complex matchups, which just take extra time to research. You know, on a lot of cards you may have a good number of fights where, you know, there's a lot of debutants or a lot of heavyweight fights with guys that win inside the distance quite frequently, and then you can like research those fights quicker, because if you've got guys making their debut, well, there's not much footage available on them. And if you've got heavyweight fighters that fight to a lot of finishes, you can work through a lot of their matchups in a much shorter space of time than someone like, for example, Rose Namajunas or Moreno that's fought to a lot of decisions. So this card's just a very time consuming one to get through. And yeah, that's basically the reason why these videos are late this week. But we're getting through it. The good news is cards like this tend to be great for live betting, because when you've got complex matchups that are likely to be competitive, obviously you're going to get more momentum swings during the fight. And so the work that we put in beforehand of the fight research, it really helps to give us that big edge on live betting, which enables us to make a profit. On most weeks, most events, most UFC events, we do great. And we're on a nice little uptrend at the moment, which is cool. After this little dip, really turning things around. And whenever we have a little dip, we know we follow it up with a big winning run. That's what happens every time. And we're at the very, very early stages now of another big winning run, which I'm very much looking forward to, because we all need more money at the moment, man. The world's expensive and we need more money. So really looking forward to live betting this event. And at the end of the day, this is why I put all the work in. The more time I spend researching these fights, the bigger an edge we're going to have in live betting. Yes, it means the videos are uploaded late, but at the end of the day, we're all here to make money. That's the most important thing. That's why we've got to prioritize the fight research. So it is what it is, man. Only so many hours in the day. So I guess let's kick things off by breaking down the fight between Moreno and Amir Albazi. Okay, so where are we? Let's bring up the odds. So we can see that Moreno is currently the favourite at average odds of about 1.60, which is going to be minus 167 for an implied probability of 63%. If we take a look at the odds on Albazi, he's around an average of 2.40, which is going to be plus 140 for an implied probability of 42%. So Albazi is 31 years old, 5'5" with a 68-inch reach. Moreno, 30 years old, 5'7" with a 70-inch reach. So we can see both guys about the same age and about the same size. Nothing too major going on there. Now, Albazi's an interesting one. He's kind of been fast-tracked into the title picture after not really picking up any wins over you know, any notable opponents before he fought Kai Kara-France. Was thrown into that fight against Kai Kara-France, lost pretty clear in my opinion, but the judges gifted him a decision, and now here he is in probably a title elimination bout, right, where if he wins this fight, he's probably going to be fighting for a title. If we bring up the media scores though for the Kara France fight, we can see that the majority of people, myself included, did score this fight for Kara France pretty clear. You can see, in fact, a large number of people scored 4 rounds to Kara France. So a lot of people had it 4 rounds to 1. Can't remember exactly how I scored each round, but pretty bad decision all the same. So Albazi's kind of been fast-tracked into the title picture, and now he's facing one of the best flyweights of all time, Brandon Moreno, who at 30 years old is still young enough to be improving, certainly young enough to get his belt back, even though he has had a lot of fights, almost 30 pro fights. So in terms of how these two match up from a stylistic point of view, I actually think this fight's got the potential to be extremely close and competitive. Not necessarily because Moreno isn't capable of beating Albazi both standing up and on the ground, but something's happened with Moreno where his fight IQ is just very off at the moment, and has been over the last couple of years. Ever since this fight against Davison Figueiredo, where he lost his title, his fight IQ's definitely been off. In this fight against Figueiredo, which he lost, it was very strange. Moreno was just kind of headhunting in the fight. He wasn't really throwing the jabs and the leg kicks, which we saw caused Figueiredo such a big problem in these two fights. So instead, he kind of he started trying to headhunt and land a big shot and knock Figueiredo out. And as a result, he got outpointed and outworked essentially, because Moreno wasn't fighting at that usual high pace that we expect from him. He was getting outstruck by Kara France, in my opinion, before landing a bit of a Hail Mary body kick, which ended the fight. Didn't perform particularly well in the Pantoja fight. Won big percentages of the rounds in that fight, but kept making silly mistakes and giving up cheap takedowns, cheap back takes at really bad times in fights to gift rounds to a very tired, very gassed Pantoja. And then in the last fight against Royval, again made a lot of mistakes, just didn't fight at his usual high pace. Didn't use that much wrestling, when we've seen wrestling obviously be a big weakness in Royval's skill set in the past. Moreno's in this really weird place where his fight IQ is definitely costing him, and in every fight I'm seeing him making decisions which ultimately make fights and rounds closer than they need to be. So when you look at how these two match up stylistically, you can look at Moreno and say, he throws a higher volume of strikes than Albazi. He's very durable. He's got a great chin. He's a better boxer than Albazi. He should be able to outstrike Albazi. And then you look at how scrambly Moreno is on the ground, how decent of an MMA grappler he is. And that kind of scrambliness and MMA grappling should do a pretty good job of tiring Albazi out. We saw Albazi fade a bit in his last fight against Kara France. And so it's a good stylistic matchup for Moreno, in the sense that Albazi doesn't really have any major advantages over him anywhere, and we know Moreno is very durable, and we know he's got great cardio, and we know he can fight at a very high pace. But at this stage in Moreno's career, fight IQ is becoming a big issue for him. He's making a lot of bad decisions in fights, and because Albazi's reasonably skilled everywhere, he's a reasonably technical striker, reasonably capable grappler, his cardio isn't terrible. I feel that at this stage in Moreno's career, he's going through this phase of fighting to the level of his opponent rather than fighting to the best of his ability. If he comes in this weekend and fights to the best of his ability, I think Moreno will win very comfortably. But he hasn't done that for a really, really long time. And so I'm expecting this fight to be really close. I don't have a super strong opinion on it, to be honest. This fight's brilliant for live betting. Very much looking forward to live betting this one, but pre-fight betting, I don't have much interest in this fight in terms of the money line. Very close, could go either way. Now, in terms of the over-under on this one, very likely this fight goes deep. We can see that Albazi, even though a few of his fights, the majority of his fights in the UFC have ended inside the distance, he's not particularly dangerous, doesn't have too much power in his hands, not that dangerous on the ground. And I mean, even if he was dangerous on the ground or dangerous on the feet, we know Moreno's got a granite chin and he's difficult to put away on the ground. We've seen that in his fights against Alexandre Pantoja. And if you look at Moreno's record, obviously he goes deep in fights frequently. In fact, the last time we saw an early finish in one of his fights was 4 years ago, back in 2020, and that was due to a random injury anyway. So very likely this fight goes deep. The odds are too steep for me to play the over 4.5 rounds or over 3.5 rounds, but I wouldn't be betting on this fight to end inside the distance. And then in terms of most likely outcomes for the prop bets, the only prop I would really consider on this one would be Moreno by decision, but the odds are terrible, and 25 minutes is a long time in the octagon. So with this being such a random, chaotic sport, I would just personally prefer to bet Moreno moneyline if you really want to go down that road. But again, I don't love the odds on Moreno. I don't see value there at all. I think it would be a mistake to bet Moreno at those odds because I see this as being a razor close fight. This probably is dog or pass. The difficulty in leaning towards the underdog is that we know if Moreno shows up and performs to his full potential, he should beat Albazi very comfortably. It's just that it's been a long time since we've seen Moreno perform well, in my opinion. Even the fights that he's won in recent years, like the Kai Kara-France fight, the most recent Figueiredo fight, I don't think Moreno's looked particularly good in either of those matchups. So this one, very easy pass for me. So I hope you found that useful. Now let's break down the next fight on this card, which is going to be Mike Malott versus Trevin Giles. So if we start off by taking a look at the odds on this one, we can see that Malott is a pretty big favourite at average odds of about 1.32, which is going to be minus 313 for an implied probability of 76%. If we take a look at the odds on Giles, he's around an average of 3.60, which is going to be plus 260 for an implied probability of 28%. So Malott has got home advantage on his side. He's Canadian. We spoke a lot about home advantage in the United Arab Emirates on the last card. We were able to profit from that by sniping a very, very nice live bet, leaning into home advantage. And so, yeah, made a nice cheeky little profit on last week's card, which was nice. And home advantage is obviously a big part of our strategy for betting UFC, because we know that Canadian fighters win around 65% of the time when they face foreigners in Canada. So straight away, Malott has got that strong trend behind him, but at 65%, that isn't strong enough to justify his pretty steep price tag at 77% on this implied probability for his odds. So we're going to need to see more from Malott to justify those odds. So he's 32, 6'1" with a 73-inch reach, and Giles is 32, 6 foot tall with a 74-inch reach. So both guys roughly the same age, roughly the same size. Now, Malott's last fight was really the first chance we got to take a really good look at him. Because if you look at his fights going back over, the last 4 or 5 years, they've all ended very quick. Where you see some decisions here, right, they were grappling matches. The last time we saw him go deep in a fight prior to his last fight against Neil Magny was all the way back in 2015 against Thomas Diania, which was 9 years ago. So the Magny fight told us a lot about Malott, and it's a very, very strange fight when you watch it back. When we were live betting this fight at the time, Malott was obviously in complete control. He was a big favourite in live betting, and he was cruising on the feet, right? He was dominating Magny on the feet, dominating Magny on the ground. Magny had nothing for him. Malott was up 2 rounds going into the 3rd round. It was total domination. And he was a big favourite in live betting. But we make our money. The reason that we've been able to produce such incredible profits over such a long period of time live betting on the UFC is because we're very good at reading momentum swings early. And so whenever a big momentum swing comes in a fight, and I haven't read it, I haven't seen it come in, I'm always quite harsh on myself, like I should have seen it come in. Because the fact that I didn't see it come in means for me it's a missed opportunity for us to all make money in the live betting group. So when Malott is in total control, and then suddenly momentum flips in Magny's favour, and Magny gets the late stoppage, I immediately start questioning my own judgment as to whether I missed something in the fight, and whether I should have been live betting Magny based on a potential momentum swing. Because I thought when Magny suddenly flipped the fight on his head, put Malott in a bad position on the ground and got the finish, I thought there must have been signs in round 2 that could be coming. And so this week was the first time in a while that I've watched that fight back in the cold light of day. And this is a really useful process for live betting because you get to coach yourself and improve and develop by watching fights back that you either bet and lost money on, or bet and won money on, or were thinking about betting and didn't pull the trigger. It's nice to watch the fights back in the cold light of day, to evaluate actually what was happening, to kind of review your own performance, right? And this fight turned out to be very strange, because when you watch it back in the cold light of day, there really is barely any indication that a momentum swing is coming in Neil Magny's favour. And that's quite significant in the context of this fight, because the Magny fight wasn't one of these fights where Malott's in control and then he starts to tire and fade and momentum gradually swings in Magny's favour. Malott was quite comfortable. He was in total control. He was outstriking and outgrappling Magny with ease, wasn't really showing any real signs of slowing down, and even when he started to look a little bit tired, he was still quite sharp on the feet, still very physically imposing on the ground. So with Malott, I don't think there's that big of an issue with his cardio. I think he did a pretty good job of pacing himself against Magny. Yes, if you go and look at his fight against Adam Fugit, he did start to look a little bit tired, but generally speaking, I think Malott is pacing himself pretty well and his cardio isn't that bad. And so what the Magny performance says to me is Malott could be one of those guys where if you put him in a bad position, he could cave mentally and kind of wave the white flag and give up. Now, it's a little bit inconclusive because it's only happened one time in the Magny fight, but Magny is at a very low level on the ground. When you're kind of capitulating, waving the white flag, giving up against a guy like Neil Magny, that's a huge red flag to me. So the mental side of Malott's game is definitely in question for me. And Judge St. Pierre famously said the fighting was 90% mental. I'd be very worried about the mental side of the game for Malott if you're thinking of betting him this weekend. The good news is Giles isn't really that kind of dogged, determined guy with a killer instinct to go in there and make him pay. I mean, to some extent neither is Neil Magny, but Giles probably less so because Giles fights at a slower pace than Magny. And so this is an interesting matchup because when you look at the odds, they indicate that Malott's got huge advantages over Giles in this fight. And to be fair, on surface level, from a technical point of view, he does. Malott's got home advantage for a start, which is huge in Canada. But Malott's also a more technical striker. He hits harder. And the real difference between these two is that Malott is a far more physically imposing grappler. Now, Giles has made big improvements to his takedown offense and ground game over the years. But Giles is still a guy that does have a habit of giving up cheap takedowns. We saw that in one of his recent fights against Preston Parsons. And he's not the most skilled on the ground, but he's a lot scrambly, he's a lot harder to take down, he's a lot harder to hold down than he used to be. So when I look at this fight, this is a fight which Malott has the advantage standing up on the ground, and he's got home advantage. But the way that he capitulated against Magny is a big red flag. And Giles has got a nice jab, decent kicking game, scrambly on the ground, decent cardio, and he can hang in there with Malott for 3 rounds. And so this is one of those fights where, for me, with how easily Malott capitulated on the ground against Magny, it would be dangerous to bet him as a big favourite here. Because Giles is more dangerous on the ground than Neil Magny, there's no doubt about that. No doubt about that. So if Magny is able to put Malott in a position where he capitulates, you bet your ass Giles can do the same. So while it's difficult to bet Giles in this fight because he is second best to Malott everywhere, at the same time, if you really want to bet this fight, it is dog or pass, because you would be crazy to bet on, Trevin Giles. You'd be crazy to bet on Malott as a big favourite. So I don't like the money line on either guy here. Giles, decent underdog, but second best everywhere technically. Not the type of situation I like to get my money into. Malott, too big of a favourite, very bad risk to reward for betting him when there's a lot of things Giles can do to cause him problems. Now, in terms of the over-under, that's far more interesting to me. Over 1.5 rounds is very, very, very interesting to me. Very interesting to me. Because Giles is a tough guy, well-rounded. Yes, he's been finished a bunch of times early, but we're seeing an evolution in Malott's style of fighting where, when he first came to the UFC, he would come out the gate really hard, try and ragdoll everyone to the ground, and get him out of there quickly. But he did start to tire a bit in the Fugit fight. And so we saw a very conscious effort from him and a very conscious adjustment against Neil Magny to just fight at a slower pace and pace himself. And so if we see a slower paced performance from Malott this weekend, I think the fight will creep past that 7.5 minute mark, and the over 1.5 rounds is very tempting. I'm going to research this fight for a second time just to be sure on the over. There's a lot of football tonight, so while the football game's on this side of my monitor, I'll research the Malott Giles fight again on this side of my monitor. Of course, I'll post in Discord, let you guys know who are members of my website if I do end up putting the trigger on the over 1.5 rounds. If you're not a member of my community and you're watching this on YouTube, you might want to just research that fight yourself and think about the over 1.5 rounds yourself. That's something I would look at personally. But I can't tell you now whether I'm betting it or not, because I need to take a second look at it. This week's been super busy, so I haven't made my mind up on it yet. And I like to just sometimes with some bets just take a second look at it rather than jumping in. I've been a bit sick this week. This card's very time consuming. The ones of research I got a new Peppy, it's just been carnage this week. So in terms of the prop bets for this one, an interesting prop for me would be Malott by decision, because again, we have seen him make a conscious decision to pace himself better. Giles naturally fights at a slow pace anyway, and with Malott getting finished late against Magny, coming into this fight against Trevin Giles, psychologically he may be thinking about fighting even more safer and more smarter and more cautious than usual, and really slowing that pace down to make sure that he doesn't struggle and feel uncomfortable late on. So yeah, Malott by decision's an interesting one to me. So I hope you found that breakdown useful. Now let's break down the next fight on this card, which is going to be Marc-Andre Barriault versus Dustin Stoltzfus. So if we start off by taking a look at the odds on this one, we can see that Barriault is the favourite at average odds of about 1.51, which is going to be minus 196 for an implied probability of 66%. And if we take a look at the odds on Stoltzfus, he's around an average of 2.64, which is going to be plus 164 for an implied probability of 38%. So Barriault's 34 years old, 6'1" with a 74-inch reach. Stoltzfus 32 years old, 6 foot tall with a 75-inch reach. So again, both guys pretty much the same age, pretty much the same size. Barriault does have home advantage, which I think is quite a massive factor in this matchup. There are some fights on this card where I don't think home advantage is going to be that big of a deal. Some fights on this card where I think it's going to be a really big deal. This is one of those fights where I think it's going to be a really big deal. The reason being, this is one of those fights where Barriault just has that edge everywhere. Just that little bit better than Stoltzfus everywhere, right? Both guys are quite tough and durable. Not that durability really matters in the context of this fight, because neither guy is particularly dangerous. Neither guy is dangerous on the ground. Neither guy has knockout power. You know, if you look at Barriault's fights, even though a lot of his fights have ended inside the distance, he's just not a dangerous fighter. And styles make fights. If you look at Stoltzfus' record, again, a lot of his fights have ended inside the distance, but he's just not a dangerous fighter. So when you throw two guys in the octagon with one another that are not that dangerous, obviously the fight is a lot more likely to go deep, a lot more likely to go to a decision. And I do see this fight going to the decision, which is why home advantage for Barriault is a big one here. Because this is one of those fights where, for me, Barriault just has that, 10 to 20 to 30% edge everywhere, right? So Barriault's cardio is probably 30 to 40% better than Stoltzfus's. Barriault's striking is probably 20% better than Stoltzfus's. Barriault's grappling is probably 10 to 20% better than Stoltzfus's. He just has that little edge everywhere. So while Stoltzfus is capable of making this a competitive fight, because it's not like Barriault has huge advantages everywhere, they're just marginal ones. The way I would look at that is, with this fight being in Canada, and how big home advantage is, how big one-sided biased judging is in Canada, In order for Stoltzfus to win a decision in Canada against a Canadian like Andre Barriault, he's probably going to have to win dominant, decisive rounds beyond all reasonable doubt. Because we know if the rounds are kind of close, competitive, subjective, which way you go, chances are the judges are going to score them for the Canadian, give them the mark Andre Barriault. And so, because Stoltzfus doesn't have any huge advantages anywhere that would enable him to put dominant rounds in the bank, I think it's going to be very difficult for Stoltzfus to win a decision in Canada against a Canadian. And because he's not, a dangerous guy, not that dangerous on the ground, doesn't really have knockout power, there's not much chance of him finishing Barriault. And for that reason, when you add everything up, I think Barriault is very likely to win this weekend. So Barriault is a very tempting bet for me this week, just because I think Stoltzfus' paths to victory are all very limited. So I haven't decided if I'm going to be betting on Barriault yet. Super close to pulling the trigger on him. I've obviously only got one bet at the moment posted on Discord, and I'm considering the over in the over 1.5 rounds in the Malott Giles fight. Also considering Barriault. A few of the bets I'm considering as well, which I'll be talking to you guys about in those breakdowns. Barriault's very tempting, and I will obviously let you know if I pull the trigger on him, but I just want to take a second look at it. My problem with Barriault is the same problem I kind of have with Stoltzfus, in that Barriault doesn't do a particularly good job of putting his stamp on rounds, which is why he's lost so many decisions in his career. He's lost a couple split decisions. He doesn't really do a particularly good job of putting his stamp on rounds. However, that might not matter in Canada, because if the fight turns out to be close, the judges probably give Barriault the nod anyway. So in terms of the over-under on this one, very likely the fight goes deep in my opinion. Again, styles make fights. Neither of these guys are particularly dangerous. So the over 2.5 rounds is pretty tempting. I think that hits. I know they've both fought inside the distance a lot, but neither of them are particularly dangerous anywhere, which is kind of like the perfect storm for a fight going to a decision. And in terms of the props, Barriault by decision is the only one that I would consider, but the odds are absolutely terrible. They're not great. So you probably better off just taking Barriault money line there. So I hope you found that. My hair's gone all crazy. My barber's currently on gone on holiday for 2 weeks, so the hair's a fucking mess till he comes back, and I can't cheat on him by going to another barber, so it is what it is. So I have to deal with scruffy hair for a few weeks, you know what I'm saying? Anyway, hope you found that useful. Thank you very much for watching. Take care, and I will see you in the next video coming pretty soon. Please like and subscribe. Helps a lot, more than you know, and it makes me feel good as well, because I feel loved. We all got issues. We all like to feel loved. The more likes, the more subscriptions I get, the better. Thanks a lot, boys. Have a great weekend. Hope you crush it. Hope you make loads of money. I'll see you all next week for another one. Nice one, guys. Bye.